This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
What's the policy process look like? Okay, the policy process from the beginning of identifying problems to negotiating treaties, etc., to finally implementing them and the effectiveness, etc. You know, the third part of the class will then be looking at different topics, different issues like the World Bank and environmental stuff, environment and trade, environment and security issues, population issues, etc. But so this middle part is sort of the policy process and thinking about at least 3 stages to it. And to kind of lead into that is to start talking, especially in this class where I talk a lot about states and treaties and interactions between states, to talk about a bunch of other actors that are involved in the environmental process, in the politics of the environment that I don't spend a lot of time on in this class because I'm more focused on the state stuff, but I want to at least introduce you to some of the other parts of the literature that are being addressed by a lot of other good scholars. So I think one way, and I've talked and gotten notes from Ronnie Lipschitz down in Santa Cruz and Kate O'Neill up at Berkeley, both of whom work on these particular issues a lot more than I do. And it was actually interesting. You've seen some of the readings. I mean, you've done the readings for today. But what's interesting is to say that these are kind of current issues. The first is I literally got both of these when I walked into the office today. The new issue of Global Governance, was a journal that has a fair bit of stuff on environmental stuff. And the whole issue is on civil society and multilateral development banks. Multilateral development banks are like the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, etc. But all about civil society, okay? Exactly what you read about today by Wapner, okay? The roles, the processes that are instilled by actors that are above individuals but below the state in Wapner's terms. And the other is this book by Ronnie Garcia Johnson at Duke on exporting environmentalism, U.S. multinational chemical corporations in Brazil and Mexico. And the common assumption is that multinationals, MNCs, are big, bad, ugly. They're the problem, basically, in short, right? These guys are the problem. This book is sort of challenging that notion and saying, not that they're great guys, but that they are one of the processes, the social processes, by which environmental consciousness and environmental protection gets moved around the globe is by corporations. And so these issues are important topics in the field, and you should at least be introduced to a little bit of them. I think always both in quarter type systems where you only have 10 weeks, which is really only 8 weeks after you get rid of the first week and the last week, it's very hard to cover any topic reasonably well. So it's a little bit like a cocktail party where you just get introduced and you say, okay, I've met that person, I'd like to get to know them better. This is sort of introducing you to some of these concepts, and hopefully then you can come contact me during office hours. I'll give you 15 other citations and you can really follow up on them. Okay, I'm happy to do that. So I want to talk essentially today about different types of non-state actors. We're going to cover a lot of ground quickly. The lecture notes, as you saw for today, if you download them already, are 1, a little less organized than usual, but 2, more extensive than usual. They're covering a lot more ground, so we're going to cover it fairly rapidly. Essentially, the kind of question to think about is who can or will protect nature, protect the environment? Who's going to do that work? And the kind of underlying theme or text in this course is that states do it through international cooperation, through international regimes. But today's lecture is to kind of challenge that a little bit and say, no, there's a lot of other actors out there who do. I mean, and one of the ways Ronnie Lipschitz thinks of it is that there are some alternative visions, and these are sort of extremes in a spectrum. One is a sort of world government that just sits out, you just get rid of states by putting some big world, the UN in some sort of airy-fairy kind of version of the UN that was actually a powerful UN that actually could do anything and could tell people what to do and make them do it, right? That's sort of one model. The other is just let the multinationals run amok, right? Kind of have private regulation, just let the market work and you'll get good solutions that way. Some mixed public-private regulatory system, and we do see elements of that as well these days with the International Standards Organization, et cetera, producing environmental rules. A variety of, Forestry Stewardship Council, we'll talk more about these, but, which has sort of set up a set of, here's how you manage a forest sustainably, and corporations try to do that because of the market putting pressures on them where people are willing to buy certified wood, just like, I buy organic food, and then thereby put pressure on agricultural producers to produce more organic food and produce less non-organic food. And it's going to be some mix of all of these things and many other approaches. And I think it's trying to think about the interaction between humans and the environment. One element of that are some structural things that we just think of them being the way they are. That when we think about what's the relationship between humans and the environment, part of that comes from this sort of social structural set of conditions that we just take for granted. Any of you who've traveled in Europe or in developing countries know the difference in how you get around, right? That here, it's like, even if you didn't want to drive your car, you couldn't do it. You just can't get there without a car in America. It's pretty hard. And that's not an accident. You can look back during a period at which cars were coming into their own, and I don't know a lot about this, but I do know there's a vignette in American history where essentially car manufacturers went out and self-consciously went out of their way to make sure that mass transit never got put in, right? Self-consciously tried to block mass transit so that there would be more, and to push public funding for roads, right? Public funding for parking lots, right? If you think about just the space that we live in. You go over to Stanford Shopping Center and you look at how much area there is, dead area for cars to park, right? Compared to a train station that would let people off and then, right? Just think of the amount of area. Any of you who are around here for the holidays, just see how many, and all that area for parking was not enough during the holidays, actually. You had people parked all the way down Arboretum and all the way down Palm, to go shopping at Stanford Shopping Center. So, whereas in Europe, it's very easy to get on a train and go anywhere. It's faster. They have, TGVs that go 300, 400 kilometers an hour. All sort, in lots of, or you see pictures of China where it's all bicycles, right? So very different models about how you relate to the environment, and just in terms of one area, in terms of transportation. And we take it as a given. Well, that's just the way it is. If nobody walks in LA, right? There's a whole song about it, right? And so that's one important element of it, but it's not an accident. The way we interact with the environment in terms of our daily lives is not an accident. The way, the power crisis in California right now, that we have houses where we have people who live, two people who live in a 4,000 square foot house. Where we wonder why we have an electricity shortage. Well, if you have to light a 4,000 square foot house for two people, in which, when in a lot of countries in the world, 20 people live in a 10 by 10 room, that's a structural condition that we think of just the way it is, that, you have to have a nice middle class house. That's what you do if you're an American. And it's not the way it is for a lot of people. So the question, so that one level is this sort of structural level that regulates how we interact with the environment. The second is this more self-conscious governance level. A way we try to regulate our activities through collective action, at some sort of self-conscious governance level. And a third is this sort of participatory activism, a sort of NGOs, people getting out there and getting involved and trying to shift things, trying to change things, change the way we interact with the environment. To just go through a couple other, so we know about treaties as one kind of, so if we see the structure of how we interact with the environment as having negative impacts, and then we think about what are the alternatives. We have treaties, we have a variety of other approaches. We have social movements and civil society. We have NGOs as part of that. We have sort of networks of NGOs, sort of groups getting together and acting collectively, even though they're not one NGO, but sort of a network of different actors all pushing the same issue. You have businesses getting together and doing it on their own. You have things like the Business Council for Sustainable Development or the International Standards Organization that are creating regulations, voluntary codes of conduct that say, if you want to be environmental, here's how to do it. And corporations can do it or not and get certified or not. And you'll now see once in a while, you'll see corporations, you'll see big signs on their buildings that say ISO 14000 compliant. Problem is nobody knows what ISO 14000 compliant means. ISO 14000 are their environmental regulations, okay? But they haven't done a good enough advertising campaign to get people so that they buy ISO 14000 compliant stuff. And there's a lot of issues with whether ISO 14000 is actually a good model for how you should produce environmentally or not. You have combinations of these. So you have things like debt for nature swaps, where in a debt for nature swap, what's happened is an NGO goes out to a patron, a funder, and says, I need $100,000. They say, what are you going to use the $100,000 for? What I'm going to use the $100,000 for is to buy debt. So to lay it out a little bit, you have an NGO here, a funder here. They get money. The NGO gives the money to a bank. Why are they giving the money to the bank? Because there's a country out here, some developing country, here, that owes a loan. Now, who of you have taken economics? What's wrong with these loans? They have loans that are worth, I don't know, let's say $20 million. Right? So you have this developing country X has a loan with some private banks that's worth $20 million. What's wrong with? Why would the bank be willing to sell that loan? Right? They're expecting a stream of interest payments, right, on that loan. Principal and interest payments. Why would they be willing to sell that loan, especially sell it for less than it's worth? Eli.
They're expecting default.
Right. They're expecting this country to default, right? They won't pay. So this $20 million to this bank may well be worth $1 million, right? Whatever that is. Let's make it $100 million. It's a $100 million loan. It's worth $5 million. It's worth 5 cents on the dollar, because the likelihood of default is so high they never expect to get this money back. This is essentially saying, of that $100 million they loan that country, they don't expect to get more than $5 million back. So they're willing to sell it for anything over $5 million. They're happier. They feel like they've got a benefit, right? So the NGO goes to the funder and gets $5.1 million. They got to make it worth the bank's while, right? They give them $5.1 million. Why is the NGO doing that? What's it getting out of it? What it's getting out of it is, here is some nature preserve. And so essentially the developing country gives protection of this nature preserve to the NGO in exchange for this getting rid of this debt, right? It's debt forgiveness with a condition. Okay, it says we loaned you, the Northern Bank says we loaned you this money, and we don't care about the environment, we care about money. Okay, we're a bank. But we do care about money, and we know that this loan, which was nominally $100 million, is only worth $5 million. We're willing to sell that loan to anybody for $5.1 million, as long as we make a little money on it. And the NGO is willing to do it in exchange for this country taking care of the land. But so now you've got non-NGOs, banks or multinational corporations, developing countries, big developing countries. So you've got states, non-state actors, multinationals, all this working together. So it's not just one or the other is the solution, but it's these really creative solutions that say, wait, there's an opportunity out here to create environmental protection, and we have to take advantage of it. The other have been things like there was a Merck INBio agreement. Merck, a big pharmaceutical company, INBio, essentially a quasi, it's part of Costa Rica's environmental ministry, essentially. And essentially they have an exchange that says, and I think it's to the tune of about a couple $1 million. Essentially, there's an exchange that goes on here. Merck says, we'll give you $1 million a year or something on that order to protect the rainforest. Why does Merck want the rainforest protected? Drug development. All these wonderful drugs that are sitting out there in trees and we don't know about them yet, right? Or bugs or whatever it is, right? And what they're giving is $1 million to protect the rainforest and to get sampling done. They're actually hiring a bunch of people, Costa Ricans, who provide samples back. Collect samples and send them back to Germany or wherever Merck is located, right? So you've got this process of trying to find where are the economic benefits of environmental protection and trying to make that happen. But this is between a government and a company, right? It's sort of the good version of a concession agreement, right? I mean, if any of you have read about the history of development in Latin America, know about concessions agreements in which resources were extracted at hugely unfavorable rates for the environment. This is sort of a new variant of that. But lots of other things like this that are combinations of states and non-state actors. So there's lots of different ways things are happening out there. Green parties. Here in America now, right? I mean, the beginnings of one, right? Ralph Nader's candidacy, but certainly much bigger. They've been most successful in Germany. There's something like on the order of about 100. There are green parties of various sizes in about 100 different countries. Okay, so there are a lot out there. So those are kind of different ways to think about it. So now to talk about global civil society. What is it? And I actually, in reading Wapner's piece in Young's book, you have to kind of go every 4 pages to get another piece of the definition. So one thing to learn it, that I can critique people's work who've even been published, right, in terms of the writing style. That he gives a definition on the first page, then 4 page later gives you another piece of the definition that helps you make sense of it, and then another piece and another piece. But the way I kind of cobbled it together was this: the domain of associational life situated above the individual and below the state. So interactions among people, right? That's essentially what it means. That aren't government interactions between themselves and governments, but interactions among people that are often across, well, if it's global civil society, across state boundaries, okay? It could be domestic civil society, but across state boundaries, and which result in a sense of allegiance and societal norms that influence the way public issues are addressed, and as such play a role in governing the world polity. Okay? So this sense of there's interactions among individuals that the state is not controlling, okay, and that aren't just private little interactions, that cross state boundaries, so they're between me and a Peruvian, or you and a Argentinian or whatever it might be. And that in some way create a sense of allegiance and norms that is create something that starts influencing others, right? Not just yourself, it's not just having a pen pal, but it's something beyond that. It's some interaction where you're trying to create new norms of behavior, either self-consciously or not. They essentially are places where you have non-formal authority, rules, and jurisdiction. Can people think of examples? I mean, can you think of how this, I mean, what are good examples of this from your own lives?
Bowling leagues.
Okay, bowling leagues are one, but what about an international? I mean, bowling leagues tend not to be international. It's too hard to get to the same bowling lanes. Okay, these are the ones that have been. This is a global civil society is a translation from a domestic arena. I mean, a guy named Bob Putnam at Harvard put together this notion of bowling leagues as civil society a few years back, and even got into People magazine based on it, right? This should worry you as an academic if you're being reported on in People magazine. But global civil society is something larger. What are some examples of global civil society?
The Olympics, maybe?
Okay, the Olympics is one. Yeah, the Olympics would be one. And what's the sense of norms and allegiance that comes out of that? I mean, it's not in the environmental realm, but not bad actually.
It's like everyone across the globe, everyone's watching the Olympics, cheering on their teams, putting money and effort into. I guess it's more domestic. I don't know, but.
Well, but there's a part of it which is, I mean, isn't part of the Olympics is this getting together and you get to know. Whatever, this is how old I am. I'm thinking Nadja Comaneci, but right, whoever that Michelle Kwan is getting to know whoever the ice skaters are, Oksana Bayul or whatever, right? I mean, getting to know people and making connections. But that's just saying, okay, that's the pen pal part of it, right? But what's the civil society part of it?
There's rules and stuff that they all need to obey.
Okay, like doping, right? Anti-dope, right? I mean, you can't do drugs, okay? So norms about what sports is, right? The norm about what it means to do a sport.
You have to agree if it's the same rules of just the sport, like how you do it.
Yeah, right.
What the rules are of the sport.
Right, that they all have to agree that you only have 4 minutes on the ice or whatever that is, and that you can't just say, no, I need 2 more minutes because in my country we have 6 minutes on the ice. That does say, no, I'm sorry, it's 4 minutes, right?
Or maybe an environmental. Weren't there international norms like about for whaling about how the whales had how they had to have ones that or the guns they had to use had to blow up inside so they died immediately or certain things like something.
They did, but that's not global. It is, but that didn't come from global civil society because that came down as a self-conscious regulatory attempt by state governments to regulate themselves. So, but try to think about, okay, so what are some things like that are kind of pretty strong norms about how people interact with respect to the environment that didn't come that way?
Well, what about Greenpeace, just as a global civil society?
Okay.
Everyone from different countries can be members.
Right. Okay.
And they all sort of push for the same goals. Like they'll have different issues.
Okay.
Like the dolphins and fishing and tuna and stuff, and like that creates norms.
Okay.
Because everyone becomes aware through that civil society.
Okay, right. And did you see any of this in reading the Chico Mendez thing? When you read the Chico Mendez article in the book today, which you all read, of course. But actually, some of this stuff is worth reading. It's kind of fun, actually. So you should read it. It's not just because I say it's on the syllabus and you got to read it. This is learning. Chico Mendez, what did they do? What's the one word they had to define? And what do you think? What else did we already go over in this class that's like that? What's the word they define in the Spanish word? What is it? Empate, right? Or it's actually Brazil. I'm sure it's Portuguese, but empate. Did any of you read it? Yeah, right. Exactly. It's a strike, right? It's an occupation of the forest to prevent deforestation by the lumber companies, right? So where else have we seen that? What? Julia Butterfly Hill, right? Up in Luna, right? She didn't devise it. And one could figure out, but that there's some process probably where there were, and I don't know the history of it, but let's say that there was an American environmental movements that were occupying stuff, right? Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? That got learned by people, by rubber tappers somehow, right? There's some process by which information is flowing. People are figuring out joint tactics. And now you got to figure that people in Indonesia may pick it up too, right? And that corporations that are going to cut down trees in Thailand are going to worry about it, right? And even if it's not, it doesn't mean that it has to be effective. The response of the Thai lumber companies may well be to go out and hire a bunch of mercenaries to protect the forest so that they can go in and cut it down, right? I mean, there's certainly likely to be that in some countries, right? Or to just pay off the government to do it for them, right? I mean, to just pull the government in to protect their ability to rape and pillage the forest. But that's in response to something where 30 years ago, they could do it without having to hire mercenaries to cut down the trees, right? So that suggests that some change has occurred not through any regulatory process that says, I mean, the deforestation agreement was just signed a few years back, and all of this stuff was happening before that, right? This attempt to protect the rainforest just because people are taking action. In Paul Wapner's book, he actually describes a really great case of it where McDonald's was, these styrofoam clamshells that they used to put Big Macs in and stuff like that, or what was the one where it's like keeps the hot side hot and the cold side cold. This is about 15, 20 years ago. They used to have like a big styrofoam thing, twice as big as any others, so they could put the burger and the bun over here and the lettuce and the tomato over here until you got it home. And so, the amount of weight in terms of packaging that you got was at least 3 times whatever you ate, right? And it would all be gone in 2 minutes after you finish these things because they don't last that long anyway. But there was no regulation that banned those. What got that changed was a bunch of people taking them after they'd eaten them and mailing them back to McDonald's. And once the mailroom started filling up with the little leftover tomato and the little leftover hamburger and the little leftover ketchup, it got a little nasty there, and all of a sudden they said, okay, we'll wrap them in paper again, right? So this process of communicating not only through the market, right, but through other mechanisms of communication. But globalization, the sort of silver lining, if you're an environmentalist and you think globalization is a bad thing, the silver lining to globalization is the fact that we are all interacting with lots of other people. We're learning more about other parts of the world. You're all, all of you, if you're at Stanford, basically everybody here goes abroad for some period of time, right? And so it's things like, or business travel. The downside is that multinationals are growing everywhere. The upside is, hey, some of these middle-class white men from Iowa actually know people in Indonesia, and are learning things through that process, right? And are gaining understandings. Ecotourism, exchange programs, scientific and disciplinary conferences. Lots of interactions going on. The question is what kinds of social norms are being created? What kind of norms and social rules are being created out of that process? You can think of global civil society at the extreme is that creates a lot of norms. What's the biggest global civil society out there? It's called the Catholic Church, right? It's global civil society, right? Above the individuals, below the state. Didn't used to be below the state, used to be above the state, but below the state. A way in which people are communicating and interacting in ways that are not governed by the rules of the state in most countries, and in which norms and allegiances, right? A lot of people consider themselves Catholic before they consider themselves whatever country they're from, right? Have allegiances that cross, or think about, or think about Islamic Jihad, right? Again, global civil society. You may like or dislike some of these different global civil societies, but they are examples of global civil society, right? So Islamic Jihad, you're creating allegiances across borders that say, I'm not an Arab, in fact, interestingly, I'm not an Arab. In Islamic Jihad, you're a Muslim, right? And the fact that you're an Indonesian and you're clearly not Arab, but you're clearly Muslim, that allegiance is more important than whether you're Indonesian or Arab, right? So that allegiance is more important. And norms of behavior about the appropriate role of violence in social change, right? Perhaps ones you don't agree with, perhaps ones you do agree with. But there are certain new norms about what, the appropriate use of bombs in society. Right? Should we use bombs merely to blow up buildings that no people are in to get rid of them, right? To take down a big building, or can we use them to get social change? So those sort of thinking of those different ways in which civil society plays itself out. Transnational movements for human rights, for indigenous peoples. This stuff by COICA, the Committee on Indigenous Peoples that you read, right, for today. To think about that process. I mean, anybody tell me a story about how does the indigenous rights, the fact that all of you know about, all of you know what the word is. When I say indigenous, you know what it means, right? And you didn't used to. 20 years ago, indigenous, you thought I was in a biology class and we were talking about what plants grew there. Now, indigenous for most people means people, right? So indigenous, what's the process of creating a global civil society around indigenous peoples, indigenas? What's that process look like? What norms are growing out of it? Because I want you to get in this habit of taking these theoretical constructs like global civil society and being able to apply it to a real case. To say, and this is one of the issues I'll push you on a little bit in some of the, I've read a few of the papers, that some of you in thinking about the tragedy of the commons do a nice job of laying out the theory of the tragedy of the commons, and then don't map it to the case, right? You tell me nicely that its substitutability and excludability are features of the tragedy of the commons, or you tell me that it has to do with private costs being not equal to social costs. But then when you give me an example, you don't say, here are the private costs. Notice how those are, positive to the individual doing the activity. And here are the social costs, which are negative. You have to map back and forth between the theoretical constructs and the empirical facts to make an argument in this kind of way. So here, use this as an example. All of you know, and who cares if you know what the facts about the indigenous movement, right? Just stylize the facts, make up the facts. But what's something that fits between global civil society, the notions of global civil society, and indigenous rights movements? What are some parts that map? Alex?
I think one story is right now in the Amazon. I think is in Ecuador. I'm not sure what countries, which the huge oil companies, I think Texaco and some other ones, are going into these countries and they're clear-cutting all these different forests and trying to install pipelines. And so these other environmental organizations such as Greenpeace and I don't know the facts, but so these environmental organizations come in and the big thing is the human rights issues, indigenous rights, the people that live there. So I think that's just one example of how global civil society comes into play here.
Okay. So can anybody kind of expand on that? So we know that it's associations across borders. So where does that part come in? So Alex has laid out a beginning of something. So somebody else fill in. Where's the association between individuals below the level of the state, but above individuals that's crossing borders here? How does that feed into the story Alex just told? He says, so all of a sudden Texaco has to worry about people getting in its way. Why do they have to worry about people getting in its way? Let's just take the information flow. Take information flow first, then power flow second.
I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but several years ago, oil companies didn't have to worry about indigenous rights. But now that we've had cases where there was huge public outcry and sympathy for indigenous peoples that were displaced, now when you go into situations like that, oil companies are no longer immune from that kind of public outrage.
Okay. So how do you get a public outcry about where did the public outcry occur?
Well, if indigenous people were marching in the streets of Quito, you've also got joining, environmental groups joining together with indigenous rights groups. We've got a large coalition of people who are all fighting for the same thing, but might come from different angles.
So what's the traditional response to indigenous peoples? Marching in the streets. It's called slaughtering them, right? I mean, traditionally, isn't that the way either slaughter them or ignore them, right? I mean, indigenous people, what are they going to do? They're not literate enough to vote, right? I mean, at least the old people in Florida can read the damn ballot, right? I mean, the indigenous peoples have a lot of knowledge, but it's not written, it's not the ability to write and read, right? Okay, so it's not literacy in the way we mean it as the ability to process written language. Okay? So I mean, I want you to think through this process of what it means. I want you to own this notion of indigenous people. What is it, what's involved? Risa?
I think also joining everything together in like this global thing is the media, because you know, if the slaughtering happened or if the indigenous people marching in the streets were just ignored, nowadays you would find out about it in the United States, and then it would cause an outcry there as well, in like for people who actually have some influence on the company that's like Texaco or whatever.
Okay. So you've got information flow going on, right? Mark and then Eli.
And not just from the media, but if you get observers or monitoring groups from Western countries where, you know, well, if indigenous people are slaughtered, it doesn't matter, but if a whole bunch of Americans or Europeans are down there watching what's going on, like in Chiapas or other places, then we'll pay a lot more attention.
Right.
Or tend to.
Okay, so there's this process where often the media responds, but the media is responding after some individual who works for Amnesty International or for Greenpeace or whatever has been down there and taken photographs and sent them to their friend, the reporter for the New York Times. You know, and then the New York Times reporter gets a plane flight down there and takes good video footage, and all of a sudden it's on the front page for a minute and a half, you know, and then we forget about it and go on about our business. But, right, there's this process where, and in fact, oftentimes it's not the indigenous peoples may march in Quito or wherever, but that's not what's putting the pressure on, because the governments are not responsive to that. I mean, they may be, it depends. You know, so there's a lot of variation here, of course. But a lot of times it's pressure from outside, right? So it's that you have some process, and here's why it matters. You have governments and maybe their elite, you know, supporters in corporations in countries, right? But then you have some polis, some polity, some group of people, and maybe we got some media up here. So here's the media. So you have this interaction, this association between individuals in different polities who are making connections, being members of different groups. So here's we're going to make some rash assumptions about power in countries, right? So here's a developing country, and here's the developed country. And here are some activists on each side of the kind of the political fence. These activists are getting information about bad things that are happening in their neck of the woods. One, the information flows from the developing country. 15 people in my town were just slaughtered by some mercenaries working for some lumber company or whatever it might be, right? They send an email back to their friends over here, right? I mean, classic case of this was Tiananmen Square, 1989. All the information was flowing out of Tiananmen Square by fax to the United States. And then these activists here are getting information out into the public and into the media, right? Which is putting pressure. Where does the arrow go here? The arrow doesn't go to here, to this government in the developing country, right? The information goes to the government here, maybe on corporations here to boycott the country, right? And to their governments to impose sanctions or whatever. And then the pressure is coming like this or like this, right? That's certainly the story we often tell. That these people are disenfranchised. I mean, you know, at least in cases where these people are disenfranchised, these people can can put pressure on the government all day long, but they don't have the political power to make it stick, right, to get change. Often, there's also this thing out here called international law, where as well, these people can reference international law as a tactic, right? Can say, no, it's okay. It used to be okay to slaughter indigenous peoples, but now there's a human rights convention that says you can't do it. And so you better, and it doesn't, there's some ways in which you should say as a realist, a realist in IR, you should say, yeah, international law, who cares, right? It shouldn't make any difference in the behavior of states, but it does because or it can, in a circumstance in which people reference that law, and these countries out here, or some set of countries who support that norm, believe that they have to support it in practice in a given case, and then use their power to enforce it. It's not likely, in fact, although a realist might say international law doesn't matter, if international law does matter, who does it matter more for? This government of the less developed country, or this government of the more developed country? Who's likely to be most influenced by it? This one, right? This country will say, the more developed country will say, well, you don't like the way we treat our people, do something about it, right? You don't like the fact that we have a death penalty in this country. Well, that's too bad, you don't like it, right? Because we're going to keep doing it, and we'll do it more rapidly if we possibly can, right? So there's this, you want to think about this kind of interaction among actors and think through. You're all smart enough to figure out this process, right? You don't have to learn this process, but you do have to think it through. It's not just out there, all of a sudden we have, corporations worrying about protecting the environment. There's a process by which their utility function in economic terms has been shifted, right? That now all of a sudden they think they have to worry about what the environmentalists say. Eli, you had a point that I didn't let you get into.
No, I was going to say.
Okay. Exactly what I was going to say.
Exactly.
Very nice. Sorry I interrupted. Kim.
Do you think that universities play a big role in this process or not?
I don't know. You think so? Tell me a story. I mean, I can imagine, increasingly I find that there's no set of facts which I can't find a theory to explain. So how do universities play? I think they probably do, but what's your thinking?
Thinking in terms of sharing information and, giving students exposure to certain issues, and the way it forces you to go out and research them, and they come back with a greater knowledge of these issues. If they end up being really passionate about it, then they start seeking out, NGOs that they can become a part of.
Okay. Okay. So there's a process by which, I think one of the interesting things, and I don't want to get to it actually. I'll try to move on here, and. In fact, let me try to build on that, because I think there's a way to link that to epistemic community, the epistemic community's argument, because there's a way in which, in this world, what's the coin of the realm? What's involved here? In other words, what makes people do what they do? What are people searching for and trying to get? It's power, right? I mean, essentially, power is what's being exchanged here, or being used to change what people think and what people do. Is power, right? It's a power-based economy in a certain sense. There's an economic economy too, obviously, that involves money, but there's power. But what Kim is raising is there's an alternative economy that it's not always that there's a linkage with the economy of power, but what's the, in other words, if we reference, when I make as an NGO, when I make an argument, we can kind of think about, let's think this through a little bit. So in NGOs, what are the resources NGOs have available to them? NGOs, you want to make a difference, right? And you're in an NGO. What are the resources they have and what are the resources they don't have? Let's say relative to a government or a corporation that they want to influence. Emily.
They don't have a lot of money.
Okay, so resources. We have, and these are the non-resources. The non-resources are money, although that can change, right? You get a nice lot of, the environmental groups have the nice phrase is charismatic megafauna, right? Big, nice, warm, huggy pandas and elephants and whales and all these things that are just, get good press and can bring in a lot of money, right? Which should worry you about all the things that are non-huggable, right? And what happens to them when they get lost. But okay, so they don't have a lot of money. What, Alex?
They don't have regulation power.
They don't have what?
Regulation power.
Okay, they don't have the power to regulate, specifically. Okay. Yeah, Kim?
They have better access to and knowledge about local communities.
Very good. So they have access. Guess how easy it is for a State Department official to get into Ecuador and do whatever they want and find out stuff. Guess how easy it is for Kim to go to Ecuador? Much easier if she's not a State Department official. To fly down, I'm just an exchange student, you know? Oh, and I just would like to see, I'm just really interested in chemical factories in Ecuador. Could you show me around your chemical factory? That'll be fun. Right? And then all of a sudden come back and say, hey, there's this chemical factory in Ecuador which is killing all the people and I found 15 grave sites out back, right? A lot easier access. So interestingly, the kind of what power a state has, NGOs may have a lot of power that's a little different than a state has. Eli.
I was going to say something similar.
Say the same thing? You keep repeating what other people said, Eli. Or we keep stealing your ideas, and that may be the issue.
Different sources of information?
Okay, information is a big resource, right? Information, and going back to the earlier point, media access, right? Okay?
But they can have a
Ashley?
lot of people involved.
Okay.
Large numbers of
People power, right? I mean, this is Cory Aquino, right? People power. That this is the old poster of Organize, right? The big fish followed by a bunch of little fish in the shape of a really big fish, right? So get enough people together, and they may not have power in material senses, but the very fact that a lot of people think something can put pressure on people to respond.
Credibility of their information?
Credibility is a crucial thing. Why is that important, Mark?
Well, they can be perceived as more credible than a country because they can be less biased.
Okay, they can be less biased. What's the other part of that? Why can they be less biased? And I mean, do we believe that? I mean, step one is, do we believe that? Do you believe Greenpeace is less biased than a government?
No, they can create the perception of being, of having no interest in it.
Okay, let's just name some NGOs. Maybe not. I don't think of them as in the environmental realm, but can you think of NGOs that really treasure their credibility and their impartiality?
Amnesty.
Amnesty is, I think, almost the case in point. It's Martha, right? Marie. What? Miranda. Sorry. Yeah, Amnesty, right? They spend a lot of time being credible, right? And a lot of time not saying things they know because they're not sure about them, right? They don't say things until they've had, I think they have a rule that they have to have gotten it from at least 2 independent sources before they report anything. So they're very careful about checking facts because the only thing they got going for them is their credibility, okay? So credibility is an important resource that they can use. Others? I mean, I think this covers a lot of them. They can, the other is a sort of morality, right? Is moral reference to say this is against international human rights law or this is wrong. To create, and that can be powerful. Not always, and it may not be powerful against really strong economic interests. But if you just say this is wrong, you shouldn't do it. That I mean, the sense of and also an important part here, and this sort of, if these are resources, then we can talk about tactics. And an important tactic is framing. That is, it used to be that Nike went in and paid people in Indonesia twice what they could have made anywhere else. Wow. That framing is a nice framing, right? People are making twice as much. Lots of people who didn't have jobs now have jobs earning twice as much as anybody else in their community. Frame it again as, and they're making 1/10 of what they make anywhere else in the world. That's a completely alternative framing. Both are true, right? I mean, the objective fact is they're still getting, X dollars an hour, or well, in these countries it's X dollars a day, but it's $2 a day or whatever. But the framing is quite different, right? Do you frame it as relative to local standards or relative to global standards, right? And so that framing is crucial, and it's framing by reference to certain moralities, right? To certain views of it, and those can be successful or not, right? I mean, so that depends. There's, you have to work those through. The other issue, and I think what I was kind of getting at in Mark's case is, I had it and lost it and just lost it again. I really lost it. Single issue, right? They can worry, there's no trade-offs. Amnesty doesn't have to trade off economic goals and human rights goals. They don't have to worry about the fact that protecting human rights may lead to lower economic gains for a lot of people, right? I mean, and whether they should or not, they don't have to. They're single issue. So their tactic is to say, a lot of times the tactic is to say, don't worry about, the other things. Change the priorities. Make protecting human rights or protecting the environment more important than economic gain. So there's a way they can focus in, not have to make trade-offs. Governments have to make trade-offs. Governments have to be, even if we're true Democrats, right, little d Democrats, we believe in democracy, then believing in democracy means making trade-offs, not being a single issue. That we have to trade off housing versus economic growth versus environmental protection and all these other things. NGOs don't have to do that. Kind of a few other things to think about in terms of tactics. Framing, certainly one. Single issue. Broaden the scope of debate. An important issue. Kind of one way to think of it is, when you're losing a fight, what do? When you were in high school and you were losing a fight, what did you do? Bring in your cousins, right? You say, I may not be able to beat you up, but I can get my cousins in here, and then we'll have a rumble, and I'll win, right? So broaden the scope of debate to a level at which you think you'll win, right? So if you're a rubber tapper in the Amazon in Brazil, and you're losing the battle to protect the rainforest so that you can continue rubber tapping, right? You move it to a level at which you think you can get more people on your side and less people on the other side, right? So broadening the scope of debate. This framing is also can be shifting the terms of debate. Okay, and an important part of shifting the terms of debate is actually getting issues on the agenda, right? Just saying, this is something we should care about. In a sense, until Tiananmen, what happened, the squelching of political rights in China was not on the American agenda, or certainly not as high up on it as it was after Tiananmen Square, right? So you can get certain issues on the agenda. Again, you've got to do it through the media, etc., and it may not always be successful. There's lots of attempts to get things on the agenda that fail. And then an important tactic is make principled but pragmatic demands. Okay? And often, this is where international law can come in. What's a principled demand is based on what the international law is, right? By reference to international law. Part of this framing is, in the shifting the terms of debate is by, you can see in the Committee on Indigenous Cultures piece, this sort of, what you're doing is referencing the norms of the strong and combining that with the interests of the weak. The indigenous peoples may or may not agree with these general norms, but they know that the people who have power believe in these norms, and those norms, if followed, would protect our interests, right? That the indigenous norms about how people should interact, the indigenous people are not so out of touch to think that their norms are going to start governing the world. No. The norms of white middle-class people in the north are what are going to be the norms that govern the world. The question is, can those norms protect our interests? So there's this reference of saying, what does power have, and how can you get the powerful to be supporting of your interests? These are all sort of issues. These are the parts of getting problems identified and getting problems on the agenda. I mean, obviously downstream, you have some other set of things of pushing negotiations forward. The pictures that Schneider showed of these people out there filling sandbags and building a dike around the Hague meeting, right? Raising the salience, right, making sure more people knew about the Hague meeting, but also shifting the terms of debate, right? To say this is not about some little fight between the Europeans and the Americans. This is a fight about protecting the earth from flooding, right? To change the way it's perceived. And afterwards about monitoring, watchdogging, even enforcement in cases, right? I mean, we liked, you know, one of the resources that's available, it's not often used, violence, right? Blowing up whaling ships. You know, they're you know, monkey wrenching, the Edward Abbey, you know, blow up dams. You know, I mean, you may or may not like that as an approach, but it's one strategy that can be used in different, you know, I mean, the eco-terrorists do it, the Aspen case, right, of, you know, so violence is another resource that can be used. A lot of people don't use it because of what they think are the long-term impacts of doing it. Okay. Lots of other issues. I mean, one of the important issues that comes out is this process between North and South, or developed countries and developing countries, about the developing countries, people in developing countries in this global civil society rightfully say, wait, you're worried about issues that are of no concern to us. You're coming down to Brazil and telling us about, you know, or to, you know, Ghana or wherever, and telling us about climate change. We're worried about malaria and dysentery. We're worried about clean water. You know, we're worried about getting the smoke out of the huts that we live in. We're not worried about climate change 200 years from now. You know, so trying to make that, one of the struggles there is getting local knowledge. I mean, this is what Emily brought up, getting local knowledge. You know, this sense of, you know, what are the issues on the ground for these people here, and how do you blend that? And I think there's a lot of tension there. Again, actually, in the piece by Mendez, he talks, I mean, it's like the second thing. He says, you know, wake up and smell the coffee, you northerners. He says, so we realized that in order to guarantee the future of the Amazon, we had to find a way to preserve the forest while at the same time developing the region's economy. So what were our thoughts originally? We accepted that the Amazon could not be turned into some kind of sanctuary that nobody could touch. Well, but as a nice American environmentalist, that's exactly what I want to happen, right? Get all the people out of the forest so that we can protect the forest, right? And this is an ongoing problem because it's also much harder to manage when you allow people into the forest, and it may be necessary to preserve cultures. So we're already back into making trade-offs between preserving the environment and preserving cultures. This is the whaling case, right? Should we let Inuit people kill whales that are threatened? Where those, even though they only kill a few whales, maybe those few whales will be the ones that push it over the edge into extinction. How do we make this trade-off between culture and cultural preservation and environmental preservation? These are issues that are hard, but I think just that fact is that I'm sure that a lot of the American environmentalists who went into Brazil said, let's just preserve the rainforest. And Chico Mendes would say, no, I'm sorry, you don't get to do that. You have to let people live there too, because people have to develop, it has to develop economically. There's a whole little piece in the lecture notes about the World Commission on Dams to kind of give you a sense of how this global civil society and the power of NGOs is playing out. So just briefly to say that you had representatives of everything from on the World Commission on Dams, which was a sort of non-governmental task force that had to write a final report last year that was going to give recommendations on politics, standards, guidelines, best practices and stuff for developing dams, right, water dams. But the commission had people from the Ministry of Water Affairs, the International Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, universities, Oxfam, Environmental Defense Fund, a Indian group that had worked on the Narmada Dam, an Indian NGO that had worked on the Narmada Dam, which was a big failure in a certain sense. So this process but that was funded by the World Bank, by governments, by NGOs, by corporations. So kind of everything's getting mixed. There's no lines anymore that keep all these things separate. A few were just on multinationals. and I think I have not actually finished reading Ronnie's book, but it's worth. I mean, if you're interested in is looking at this process by which, and there's another book called, by the Business Council on Sustainable Development. Saying there's a corporate sense of responsibility, a corporate responsibility towards the environment. And part of this comes from, hopefully, I mean, when I look at, let's say, the people coming out of international relations or environmental studies here, a lot of people going to .coms or iBanking or whatever, hopefully they still take their morals with them, right? I mean, it's not like we do worry that people, once they join those things, get, kind of become, eviscerated of any morality. But we know that's not true, right? That people do bring their morals to bear, and that you will treat people differently than people did 100 years ago when you take a corporate job. Even if you're still a corporate person, you're still going to be treating people differently. That your sense of, if you take a job working for Nike, your sensibility about what people should be paid is going to infuse, you're going to bring that to your job, right? And you may have to fight upstream against other people who say, no, pay them $2 an hour, $2 a day, and you're saying, no, let's make it $2 an hour. You may have to fight against that. But certainly you don't have to check your ethics at the door. And so there's this process by which that occurs, in which when corporations can play a positive role, and also play a negative role, surely. But that's, I think, the kind of the more obvious one that I assume you already know, how corporations, even when they're not doing bad things, are disregarding environmental protection, right? They're not worried about it. It doesn't show up in the bottom line anywhere. Although another interesting case right now is, people know a little bit about emissions trading for climate change, for CO2, right? That you can trade emissions from one country to another. So I reduce emissions here, and then I sell those emission credits to you, right? That's what they're planning to do. Where is it being done right now?
U.S.
Okay, U.S. government? Being done in California, down in LA, with respect to sulfur emissions from power plants. That's one place.
Reclaim?
What?
Reclaim.
Right, exactly. You want to say a word about that, Alex?
Not really.
Okay, but there is some emission trading that's being done by regulation. The other place it's being done is within BP Amoco right now. They've got 237 divisions or something like that. And they basically said, the future as out there involves emissions trading. And we better learn how to do it before the next guy does. And we're going to give every division within BP Amoco their current credits for their current, and I don't know what it is, something like a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions from their current emissions for every element, every division in BP Amoco. And what they now have to do is then, you don't have to emit that much, but if you want to emit more than that, you got to buy it from somebody else who's emitting less, right? And so they're proud, and they've created a nice computer program to start doing trading, and they're getting what in economic terms is called a shadow price. What's the price of a CO2 emissions that they can sell at? How much does it cost to create a CO2 emission reduction? And they're doing this, and the corporation is doing it not because they're regulated, but they just see they see downstream what's going to happen, and they want to be doing it better than the next guy when it comes into regulatory effect, right? Again, one of the stories about the ozone regime is that it didn't have a direct. The signing of the ozone protocol in 1987 didn't directly have an effect. It was the negotiations that had begun in 84 and 83 through the 85 Vienna Convention up to 87 that put DuPont and Dow and the chemical companies that make CFCs on notice and said, you're going to be regulated soon. And you sure as hell better get doing research, which you haven't been doing for the last 10 years, into figuring out what the alternatives are. And the 1987 agreement occurred, a short version of the story, a little stylized version of the story, is it occurs about 6 months after DuPont figures out a nice, cheap alternative. So all of a sudden the resistance goes away from corporations, and now you have regulation. So the negotiation process was successful, but not through regulation, but by just saying you are going to be regulated, therefore find alternatives. Once they find alternatives, the resistance goes away and you can have regulation. And so regulation is just sort of a codification post hoc of what's going to happen anyway because DuPont found cheaper alternatives to CFCs. So this process in which corporations get dragged in and interact with a regulatory environment, which is being pushed in large part by this epistemic community. Okay, and I want to say a few words in the remaining part, and we'll actually, it'll work pretty good for next time going into doing the papers, because we'll use this article by Peter Haas, which I don't, maybe I'll put a link on the webpage, and if you have time, look at it. It's an article on epistemic communities. Peter Haas, probably one of the top people in international environmental politics at UMass Amherst, has been writing on this for a while. Basically took the notion of epistemic communities and put it on the international relations agenda. It's been a huge hit. Essentially, an epistemic community is a transnational network of knowledge-based communities that are both politically empowered through their claims to exercise authoritative knowledge and motivated by shared causal and principled beliefs. Essentially, it's scientists getting together. And what do scientists have in common? Well, this is going back to Kim's point about universities, okay? What they have in common is not, when a scientist gets up there, he says, I'm powerful, I got a lot of people who work with me and they're not going to buy your product. That's a power move, right? That's what an NGO does. What does a scientist do? They say, not, I have a lot of people who are buying or not buying your product if it's organic or not. What do they reference? So an NGO references power. What does a scientist reference? Facts, truth, right? And we can take a postmodern view about truth and say there's no real truth out there, but there's some reference to something other than interest, right? That is, it may not be truth, but in some sense there's reference to power on one side, and there's power and interest. And here it's, and I'll put it in quotes, truth, facts, knowledge. Are there interests embedded that? Surely. Right? I mean, the fact that we know so much about climate change reflects two facts of interest. One is that people in scientists in America who are studying climate change don't have to worry about malaria or clean water or keeping smoke out of their houses, right? Because those problems are solved, and so those aren't our. So does our interest in climate change reflect does our knowledge about, the depth of our knowledge about climate change reflect our interest? Yes, the fact that we don't have to be interested with clean water and malaria and all that stuff. But it also reflects where the money goes, right? I mean, I just sent in a grant yesterday. What do I write the grant to? What people are funding, right? And I mean, you saw a huge sea change in what people funded when I was in graduate school in 1989, 1990. In 1985, I should have written my grant about preventing nuclear war. In fact, in 1985, I was in grad school doing work on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In 1995, what should you be writing your grant on? Protecting environmental destruction. But part of that is not, I mean, the funders are responding to changes in the world, but the people who are receiving the funding are responding to the funders. And funders can say, hey, you know, I think the real thing you should be working is AIDS. Or I should think you should be working post-conflict or whatever. So funders, you know, if you're some zany philanthropist, right? If you're Hewlett or Packard and you got a couple $billion sitting around and you think people should work on, you know, on UFOs, you can get a lot of really smart people working on UFOs really damn quick. You throw enough money at the problem. I will write how, the environmental impact of UFOs on the Earth. I mean, I can reframe my thing, and I actually might find some, right? I'll go back, you know, down to Area 51 or whatever, and, you know, find all the environmental impacts of this, you know, these UFOs coming in. It will turn out that it's just the military, but, you know, so I think there's this, there's this process of where scientists have the scientific method. It may not find truth. I have my doubts that scientific method finds truth. The nice thing, as we talked about, the nice thing about the scientific method is it's replicable, right? At least I can tell Kari, here, you follow these rules and I'll believe your answer, right? So there's this process of agreement. It's not just interest-based. I don't have to know what Kari's politics are before I give her the assignment. And if she follows the rules of my assignment, I will trust her answer regardless of whether she's a Democrat, a Republican, a Green, you know, a Christian Democrat, whatever. You know, I don't care about any of that stuff because I have a process. And it's this, I'll just briefly lay out the argument and then we'll stop. But it's a sense of, in which, and this is in the lecture notes, but you have some environmental crisis here. And coupled with some uninformed decision makers, some uninformed policy makers, okay, something happens. Big bad, the Mediterranean gets polluted, and they don't, and the policymakers don't know why. These two facts come together. You consult the scientists at universities that Kim was at least alluding to, right? Well, you consult the scientific community, because these two together create huge uncertainty. So under conditions of uncertainty, the policymakers need to know what to do. Who do they ask? They ask the scientists. These scientists do two things. One is they set the international agenda. The scientists get together at a nice little conference in Geneva. They talk about certain things. This is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a classic case of this. Have an environmental crisis, warm 1980s, warming weather. Scientists put that on the agenda. The policymakers don't know what to do. They call up the scientific community and say, why don't you put a big report together telling us what the state of the science is? That sets the international agenda to say, it's 6 gases. It's CO2, it's methane, it's CFCs, it's nitrogen oxides, etc. All the gases, it says, and these are the things we have to regulate. That starts the process rolling. So in 1992, we have some international regulation. But then importantly, so sets the international agenda, we get negotiations. But in addition, you have these scientists, these policymakers still don't know what to do. They appoint these scientists to be the head of the new EPA, right? So these become policy-making scientists, in a sense, either directly or indirectly, right? Either as advisors or actually bureaucrats. They kind of get their own, they push back on these policymakers to support the negotiations, right? So you have this process internal to the country where these people who are making these connections, again, it's like a world civil society argument, these global civil society, these scientists are making connections and pushing the same agenda each in their own country, right? So you have the big science advisors in each country pushing the same agenda. We should support climate change negotiations. We should support the implementation of it. We should support the ratcheting up of the regulations, etc. And over a long term, this process creates convergent policies, right? The fact that for all the problems between the US and the EU, they're a lot closer than they were 20 years ago, right, with respect to climate change. There's still differences, but the scientists are actually trying to push them together. You could see Schneider here when he was here last week, right? You know that his agenda is to get the scientists both in Europe and the United States together to push so that they both agree, so the governments agree, right? You see that process going through. So it's another version of this story about non-state actors playing an important role. So we'll leave it there.